Yeah, Twin City Rapid Transit, it was called everything back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I got out of service, I didn't like the job I did have because I was delivering meat to restaurants and hotels. So I used that opportunity, driving a meat truck around delivering meat. I stopped in at the employment office at the Twin City Lines because they were hiring. So when I went in to get the job, they told me I was too young. And here I come home from the war, married, had a little daughter. I told them that. I said, how can I be too young? I fought a war, married, got a little daughter. Don't make sense. They said, well, we'll give you a try. So they give me a try, and I hung in there. Then I had to train 40 hours as a conductor, not driving, but as a conductor, sitting in the back end of the streetcars, and 40 hours as a driver. And then, beside that, they had transportation all night long. And they had owl lineups in Minneapolis and St. Paul. You made like 12, 1, 2, 3, 4 on-the-hour lineups. And with the lineups, everybody met at a certain spot. Everybody, all the streetcars lined up. They called it the lineup. And from then on, I had to take, I think it was 4 days going with the owl driver. And from that time on, then you had, I think about 8 weeks where somebody was with you. You went out and student each line with someone. The fellow that chose the run, you went out with him to student the lines. I'll never forget the run over the Washington Avenue Bridge by the university campus. George Behrens was my driver, and I was a conductor in the back. And a lady come up and asked me, she said, how come they go so slow over the bridge? And George Behrens heard her say that. And he said, lady, we do that so you can make peace with the Lord and ask forgiveness of all your troubles before we drop in. That lady was uncomfortable across that bridge. Yeah, that was an old bridge. Oh, it was busy, busy, busy. All commercial. But university campus, you'd go into University of Minnesota and the street would just be black with people. You'd open up both the doors and let them pile in, and close the doors and then take off. Then after you hit 7 Corners, there was kind of shanty nightclubs down Washington Avenue. And you see any sights of the nights along there. Maybe Portland, I think, we're coming to Washington. What's the Hennepin County Medical Center on Portland?
Yeah, I think pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, right there they had a railroad trestle, and a lot of times people that had a little bit too much to drink, they'd hit that wooden structure. It was made out of wood. And they hit that, and the car would roll over on the tracks, and that would tie you up for 2-3 hours. But the worst part now, coming into Minneapolis from the city limits at Bedford Street, there was a fella, this was during the rush hour in the evening. Rush hour was, from about 4 o'clock till 6. And there was a fella, this was in the winter time, not hardcore winter because the snow didn't quite pile up yet. But he came down from St. Paul and he tried to pass a streetcar on the left side when one was coming the other way. And he got squashed in between the two of them. It killed him naturally, but it tied up everything for hours and hours. But luckily, there was a Y at the city limits, and they kept the streetcars running in St. Paul because they could turn around at that Y and go back and forth. But in Minneapolis, that was all tied up. They couldn't get in from Minneapolis to St. Paul. So that was the worst I've seen of any tie-ups. They were tied up till after 7 at night. Well, there was a big drugstore at the corner of Raymond and University, and we had a inspector. His name was Ralph Litch, really a swell guy, and he'd be standing up there in the wintertime with a big sheepskin on, checking the cars as they went by to see if they were on time or tied up. And he'd get so doggone cold out there, and he had certain drivers that he liked, and I was one of them. And he says, Laddie, he says, when you come in from Minneapolis, they'll have when you come in from St. Paul, they'll have a package for me at the drugstore there. Well, I said, yeah, I'll run in right quick and I'll pick it up for you. So when I went in and picked it up, I found out that it was liquor. It was a bottle of liquor. You take a snort to keep warm. It was the only, they didn't have no place to stand inside at that time. So he thanked me real well for it. So he never bothered me from that time on. If I was a couple of minutes ahead or something, we were buddies. And there was a St. Paul water truck washing the streets with the water on University Avenue, and he just filled his truck at Pryor with water, and he made a U-turn on University Avenue, and a streetcar, try to think of his name now, knew the Motorman. Anyway, he made a U-turn right in front of the streetcar, and the streetcar hit him. Well, it bent the streetcar the shape of that water truck in the front. Darn, I can't think of his name. Anyway, there were 5 people sitting in the seats had their teeth knocked out from the impact that hit the seats in front of them. I remember that real well. And all the way in, they had safety aisles that was just flat concrete about that high up off of the street itself. And then later on, they put like a rounded thing about 4 or 5 feet high that if a car hit, they wouldn't hit the people standing on that safety aisle. Well, that was sometimes bad too, because I've seen where the cars would hit that, then they'd roll over onto the track. That tie up some more. Or if there was a fire, the fire hoses going across. If it was a big fire, like at Waldorf Paper Company, that was at Vandalia University. If there was a big fire, then they'd send a crew out and they called them bridges over the hose. There was another track just over the hose. You had to go real slow to get over the hose that you wouldn't cut it. Then as you went farther in, you get to Snelling University. Man, that was a massive streetcar tracks there. Oh, was there a streetcar? Because they had all the pull-in and pull-outs there. Wherever they were going, they had a pull-in. Some pulled out on Snelling closer to St. Anthony. Some pulled out right at the intersection. And that was the busiest intersection in St. Paul, Snelling University. And Larry Hanover one time, he hit a switch there, and the back trucks, he hit it with the front trucks, and it was enough to flip that switch, and he was going pretty good clip. And the back trucks flipped over on the other westbound tracks. So here he was sideways with trucks on each track, and it had everything blocked. Nothing, even the traffic slowed up, couldn't hardly get by because he was sideways in the street. And I'll never forget the Templeton. Templeton was the General St. Paul superintendent. He was notified to the scene. At that time, their main office, St. Paul, was at College in Wabasha. They had a building there, and I think it was booster power in there too to send more power. But anyway, he was notified up there, and he come up with his little red card that said Twin City Lines on the door. And he says to Larry, he said, you know, I ought to fire you. You hit them switches too fast. And Larry said, no, sir, please don't. Where else is a man my age, 56, going to get a job like this with 3 weeks vacation? And Templeton just laughed at him, and he said, oh, forget about it, Larry. But there was a lot of tie-up there at that intersection with all the tracks. Then they had their own work cars. They'd haul rails, they'd haul coal. That was another thing, the coal. The older streetcars, the new ones were all electric heat. But the older ones had a little furnace right under the car toward the back. They had a chimney going out the roof with a shield across the top of it. And to get heat in that car, you had to stoke up the furnace in there. And beside that furnace, they had a little coal bin where there was a supply of coal, and you'd shovel that coal in on the fire when you got to the end of the lines. And most end of the lines had a coal box with coal in it where you could replenish. And to get that, them things were cold. I mean, you had big, heavy boots, and he even drove with mitts on, because that little furnace couldn't heat up. You had the doors opening and closing. And that little furnace couldn't heat it up, so we throw rock salt on it. They never knew it, but we did. And with the rock salt, it would flare up and get a fire going in there. Most of the time, you had to fake your way through. Somebody would give, and you had to fake your way through. But the Snelling Avenue line was the main line for the fair, going across Snelling Avenue. Comos would pull out there, and they had a dump over across from the fairgrounds on Como, and the work cars going over to the dump and stuff, they'd be going on there too. The work cars was a little cubicle on the front with just the controls, and then the back was all flat like a flatbed truck. And some of them had cranes on if they had to raise the car to put it back on the track. Or then we had our old snow plows in there too. And we were the first ones to plow the streets in the winter time to keep the streetcars running. And they had a wing out, and you had to pull that wing in by hand on a rope as you went around cars. But if the snow was deep enough, that snow pushing up, when you come to a car, it would automatically push it. You wouldn't hurt the car because you'd have a lot of snow between you. And they were just a box with a blade in the front and a wing on the side plowing the snow. Yeah, Tom Lowry was the one that started it. And there was a corporate raider, I think they called him back then. Green was his name. He come in to just bleed everything out of it and run. Get the money out of it and run. And he didn't care about the people or anything. He got a cut here, got a cut there. Didn't even give it a second choice. Cut. Then we got down to that Snelling University now. They had overhead wires all over up there for different tracks that you pulled in and the tracks were numbered. They tell you pull it in on certain track. Then you had a hand switch, a little hole with a switch rod you stuck down in there and turned that switch so you get on the right track. But then later on they came with electric switches. And you'd go along and you'd, if you were, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. This would be down by Rice University. But with the electric switches, it made it so convenient, but all of them weren't electric because I think it costs pretty much to put in the electric switch. But the electric switch, you threw it with the power on. With the old streetcars, you had the handle here at it. And you'd throw it with the power on, the switch would throw. And if it was throwing and you wanted to go the different way, you'd coast over it and that switch would go the opposite way. And a lot of the clears, the overhead wires had targets on them. You had a big red target with S, meant stop. And then there was a green target with a S, meant slow. You were coming by a fire station, that you had your car under control in case a fire rig came out. And then we had telephones every so far mounted on boxes at the main intersection. Sometimes we'd have to walk 3-4 blocks to get to it, but it helped at that time. Then there was a prom ballroom a half a block down. And that prom ballroom, many, many nights, it depended upon who played there, they had to send out extra cars to pick up the people, to take them downtown to transfer on their cars that go near their houses. Then you went by the state capitol, and when the capitol left out, it took 3 or 4 streetcars in a row to fill up. The rush hours in the morning, we had to have a dispatcher out there 1 minute apart, the streetcars on University Avenue. The old saying went, if you missed one, you had to run like hell to catch the next one. That was the old saying back then. But all the way to Capitol, then we went by the main office building of the Twin City Lines. They had a substation in there too to boost the power. Then down there, going into St. Paul, right by the main office, you had the St. Paul, Minneapolis, you had the Como Harriet, you had the Hamlin Cherokee coming right by the office, and the Rice South St. Paul. So they could sit in the window and pretty much watch as you were coming in. And if you did something wrong, the old man, Templeton we called him, he'd call you to the main office, not the foreman up at the Snelling and the University. That's the garage I worked out at Snelling University. But if you did something wrong, he made a point that you came down to his office, down at College in Wabasha. Then he'd have you sit down there. It seemed like forever, but I'm sure it was only 15, 20 minutes. Then when he finally called you in, he'd say, "Did you hear that phone ringing?" "Yes, sir." "You know what that was all about?" "No, sir." "That was because of you. They're calling in complaining to me about you. Can't you cut it off?" "Yes, sir." "Okay, get back to work." Yeah, we put up with that a lot of times. I want to tell you about another incident here. The fella never was recognized for it, and I think he should have been, and he's long, long gone now. But his name was Ray Kruger. Some kids got in where they built the streetcars in the back, the Snelling workplace. And they had turntables. They would run the car on the turntable, and then they'd turn it and put it in different places where they wanted to work on it. Some kids got in there, and On the streetcars, your air valve, if you let go, it would go over and put on the brakes. The work cars never had that spring. Wherever you put that air valve, that's where it stayed. Okay, some kids got in there and started fooling around with one of the work cars. And they started up that work car. It's a good thing it was going real slow. And it went right out by Montgomery Ward, Albert Street. Come right out on Albert Street onto University Avenue, real slow. And there happened to be a fella going home from work. He worked a split shift. And he saw that work car come out as he was going home, and he didn't see nobody by the controls. So he put two and two together and looked up again, didn't see nobody. So he sped up down the line a little bit, jumped out of his car, run after this work car going real slow. He jumped on it, went up and stopped it. Then he called, if that would have went down as far as Lexington, that would have picked up speed and it would have went all the way to the Capitol. And he stopped that work car and he called up and told him that he stopped the work car out there on University Avenue. So they had to come out and get it back in. But he never, to the day almost that he died, I asked him if he was ever thanked for it. He said no. Never, ever was thanked for it. And look what the damage it could have done, yeah. But there was incidents like that. We had supervisors hiding behind buildings. There was one over on Como that hid in the coal bin. Coal bins were about that high and about that wide. And we were always told to lock them because they didn't want people stealing coal out of them. Anyway, he climbed in the coal bin and he had the top up like that, looking as you went by. And this wasn't the drive. This was on the Como area. This wasn't on University. But the motorman said to the conductor, he said, "Hey, the last guy forgot to lock that coal bin. It was right by the fairgrounds." And he says, "Open up the door and I'll jump out and I'll lock it." So he goes out, jumps under and locks it. About 2 or 3 cars later, one come along, he needed coal. So he takes out his key, opens up the coal bin, and here's the supervisor in there. Oh, that was the laugh of all of us, guys. Yeah, that was the laugh of all of us. Well, pretty much to the point they did. But I don't think any car would try to buck up against one of those big streetcars. So most of the drivers was pretty good, but there was some drivers that blow the horn at you. You could hear them cussing out the windows at you. But most of the time it was pretty good. Then a lot of times there'd be a police officer on the corner too. They'd stop the traffic and motion for you. Even if the light was red, they'd stop the traffic and motion for you to get through. But at Rice and Marion and University, a block west of Rice Street, one night, I was the second streetcar, but the streetcar ahead of me at University and Rice Street, he started up at Rice Street and he was going pretty good clip the time he hit Marion, because it's a little bit downhill there. And there was a car that come down University Avenue. There was a bar on the corner, and they found out later they came from that bar. And he came down University Avenue, and safety aisles were at each intersection. And he was on the outside, and he made a turn in front of this streetcar. And he hit that car just broadside. And the car on the side crumbled over, and it pinched the woman's toes off. Cut her toes off as the streetcar hit that car. I'll never forget seeing them toes laying on the floor of that car. But the businesses were all real friendly with you. Yeah, they knew who you were. A lot of times, like split shifts. You'd work 3-4 hours in the morning, off 2-3 hours, then you go back for another couple hours. Most of that was split shifts. Like I say, I had worked 13 years before I got a Sunday off. Most of that time was split shifts. Then I had like a Tuesday and a Friday off, something like that. But the people on University Avenue, I think they, right, especially around Snelling and University, I think they kind of favored us a little because they knew that was their bread and butter too. But especially on paydays, some would hit the bars there, and they knew where their bread was buttered. It was on the track. That was the best part, but buses had the streetcars far better, far better. Because with the streetcars, you had slippery rail, and when them wheels start sliding, you picked up speed. You had sanders on them, but in the winter and the springtime, the wheels would throw up moisture, and it would hit them little hoses hanging down, and it would freeze solid and the sand wouldn't go out. But we had sanders on the streetcars. When they worked fine, especially when they were tarring the streets. When they tarred the streets, a little tar would get over, and this time of the year when the leaves were falling, oh, would that make the rail slippery. Really make the rail slippery. It was just like skating on ice with them. And if you hit another vehicle or touched another vehicle, you were automatically fired. One time, this was funny. One time I left Dale in University, and Oscar Anderson was my driver. And we were late trying to make up time. And leaving Lexington, Dale Street, going into St. Paul, between Kent Street and McCubbin, there was a dip in the rail, a dip. And we picked up a drunken woman in Minneapolis. She was quite heavy set. And when Oscar hit that, he had her pretty well wound up. And this lady, she bounced on the seat like that and bounced off. She was passed out already, passed out, fell over in the aisle. And Oscar stopped, and we couldn't pick her up. She was too heavy. So Oscar said, well, there'll be a starter down, which was an inspector. There'll be a starter down at 7th and Wabasha. We'll check down there. So she's laying on the floor. They're passed out. And we get down there, and the starter looks, and he says, oh, 10 of us ain't going to pick her up. He's all phoned the police station right up at 10th Street. So the police came out there and took her to the detox and off. But Oscar, well, he passed on now too, but every day we talked about it, we had a laugh about it. She didn't hurt herself. That was the main thing. No, I don't think so, because I still think the majority of the people that rode streetcars still had their own cars, but they just didn't want to go through the trouble. Like one guy told me one time, he's like, come out of work, get on a streetcar, he said, I'm on my way home. I get in my car, I got to walk 2-3 blocks, the car is cold. He says that by the time I get the car warmed up a little bit, I could be home. So really saving time, a lot of people thought they were saving time. No, I don't think that's going to hurt university. I think it's going to improve university. You're going to see more nightclubs and everything else going along there. Yeah, I'm sure.